Hello, Eric Martin, Professor of History at Lewis Clark State College, talking to you History 102 students. So, we are 3 weeks into the semester now. You ought to be getting into the class. Sweet. Today's video is focused on setting up Chapter 16 in your Worlds of History book. And Chapter 16 is really focused on the creation of the Atlantic world, right? The western portions of Europe, western portions of Africa, eastern portions of South America, the Caribbean, eastern portions of North America, Gulf of Mexico. That becomes a zone of interaction. Now, I provided some written context along these lines, kind of setting this stuff up already in the discussion boards. Y'all take a look at that, and then I provided some instructions about how you should proceed for this discussion. I'm not going to cover that here. I want to do something complementary, but I want to do something a little bit different. So go to the discussion boards, look at that material. Now, last week, the thinking historically. If you notice in your Worlds of History reader, every chapter has a thinking historically element to it. That's an important element for us because that's the part that really helps us figure out how to develop the kinds of historical thinking skills for data collection, data analysis, data write-up, data presentation, and then you can transfer these skills to something else, right? So anyway, last week's skill was reading primary and secondary sources. And if your discussion posts were any indication of it, what you discovered was reading the primary sources is not as easy as reading the secondary sources because, frankly, there weren't a whole lot of postings on the primary sources. Okay, well, we're going to fix that this week because they're all primary sources, right? So this week, the whole issue is comparing primary sources. Now, part of it is you have to know how to read a primary source. But the other part of it is you have to know how to set up a comparison, right? We just can't start pulling things out of a hat and comparing one to the other. So that's important. So what I want to do for a minute here is I want to go through some of the setups you could use for thinking about comparisons with the primary sources this week, and you can use them in your discussions. So it's actually pretty easy. The materials for this particular chapter, Chapter 16, can kind of be broken into two main issues. And that is focusing on Native Americans and European interaction, and then focusing on Africans and European interaction. So documents 1, 2, 3, and 4. Those documents obviously go together. And so I think when you're reading those 3 documents and looking at the images, the question, there's at least 2 good questions you can think about, right? One of the questions, and it's probably the harder of the 2 questions, but one of the questions is, what do those documents tell you about Christianity in the Americas? You can get some clues in terms of Christianity in the Americas from those documents. But the other thing to think about in these documents is that the first 2 documents, the Bernal Diaz piece and the Broken Spears piece, they tell the same story. But they don't tell the same story the same way. And so the question becomes, are the differences in the story matters of perspective, or do they fundamentally disagree on what happened? And then, how do you, as the historian, decide which of those tales is more believable? All right, and that pulls in the Bartolomé de las Casas document. He's telling a different story, but as you get into it, you will see how it relates to those first two. So the question being for those first four documents, how do you determine whose story is more reliable? And then you have this question, right, that, okay, what do these documents tell you about attitudes of Europeans towards Native Americans? What do they tell you about attitudes of Native Americans towards Europeans? And what does that tell you about the initial setup of the Atlantic world? So that's one thing to get into. The other thing to get into, or to think about, is documents 5 through 9. And all of these documents revolve around the Atlantic slave trade. And one very productive question for you to keep in your mind as you read each of these documents goes like this. How would the author of the document describe the slave trade? Would they describe the slave trade primarily as a political institution, as an economic institution, or as a cultural and social institution? Now, of course, the Atlantic slave trade is all of these things. But as you're looking at those documents, how would those authors describe it? A couple of the Native American documents, I think, are fairly straightforward. So be sure to read the questions that Riley asks you about those, so that you have some guidelines into going into your reading. A couple of things, though, that I want to point out on the Atlantic slave trade documents. The appeal to the King of Portugal. This is a document written by one king to another king. And it has that air of it. So, from the perspective of the king there in the Kingdom of Congo, what's the issue? That's the big question. What's the issue? I guess the others are fairly straightforward too. But I guess the big question is here, right? You know, as you go through these, this is a good place to remind yourself that in history, as well as other forms of life, but we're really going to focus on history here. In history, it is very important to look up information on your author. And in this particular chapter, you need to know for all of the documents who these people are. Riley sets it up to some degree. Don't skip over that part. This is a perfect use for something like Wikipedia. I know we hear about, don't use Wikipedia, don't use Wikipedia as a scholarly source. It's not. But you might be able to plug in one of these names and find out what you need to know. Oh, I see who this person is. And then you go. Okay. So that's what I wanted to say today in order to get things set up. Now, in terms of having a good discussion on our discussion boards, man, there's only one way to do it. You got to discuss these documents in detail. The videos are easy. The videos are so easy. Don't spend all your time talking about the videos. One person will cover that material, and then we're going to move along, right? The real way to, for the more mercenary of you, the real way to improve your grade in this class is to talk about these primary sources, talk about several of the primary sources, go into detail on the primary sources. All right. I think that's probably about all I got to say today. Anyway, Don't think twice about dropping by my office during office hours. Don't think twice about calling me on the phone during office hours. Send me an email. Now is the time for us to make sure you understand what you're supposed to be doing and how you're supposed to be doing it. Beyond that, get to your reading and enjoy your historical studies.